Hello, I am Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from Children's.
The subject of this summer's summer reading program is fairy tales, mythology, and fantasy. And so today we're actually starting to explore the world of fairies. We talked about fairy tales, now we're talking about fairies in particular. I was so excited when you wanted to talk about this because I love fairies. I've been researching this kind of thing my entire life since I've been a little kid, so it's very fantastic for me to talk about this.
All right. What have you got?
Well, what do you think of when you think of fairies?
Tinkerbell.
That's not wrong.
Well, according to some of the books I've just seen, it's not right either.
Tinkerbell is the tip of the iceberg. Tinkerbell represents a softening of the fairy lore, making them more like kid-friendly. The Disney Tinkerbell is definitely kid-friendly. But the Victorians like to romanticize things and kind of like soften the sharp edges on things. So the Victorians took a lot of fairy lore that had been around for a long time and made it more fit for the nursery.
Clearly.
Well, if you go back and read J.M. Barrie's work, it's a little known fact that Peter Pan first appeared in a book called The Little White Bird.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, he had an origin story that no one knows about. The Peter Pan chapters were collected into a book called Peter Pan at Kensington Gardens. They really just selected chapters of Little White Bird. Yeah, he was a baby who was born to a family, and he had a window overlooking Kensington Garden. And one day, a gust of wind blew his cradle out and into the garden, and his parents were never able to find him again. But fortunately, he was found by fairies in the garden. It's a well-known fact that Kensington Garden in London does have a portal to the fairyland. So in the garden, he learned the language of birds. We taught him how to fly, and the fairies and so forth. And he always dreamed of being able to go back and be with his parents again. And once the birds had taught him how to fly, he flew out of Kensington Garden back to where his old bedroom had been. When he got there, you know what he found?
Time had passed?
Some time had passed, but what he found was, first there were bars on the window now so he couldn't get back in. And there was another baby lying in a cradle. And he knew then he couldn't go back. So the fairies took him off to Neverland. And he lived there forever because he never gets older.
Okay.
So there's an element of darkness in J.M. Barrie's original version that gets scaled down quite a bit. Tinkerbell is a fairy. She is one of the Fae. She's considered one of the lesser fairies because she's not that powerful or magical. We have a book in our children's room, which I didn't pull for our stack of fairy books, that goes all about the history of J.M. Barrie and Tinkerbell and so forth. Okay. Originally, Tinkerbell's origin is Tinkerbell's secret origin. There were people called tinkers who were guys who worked with metal. They would repair pots and pans.
Right.
And they were frequently Irish, and they would come around and rattle their pans and see if they can repair something for you for a few cents or a meal or something like that. And they began telling little James Barrie stories about fairies. So even though fairies in general don't like metal, these tinkers who worked with metal told him his first fairy stories. So he associates fairies with metal even though they're not really. That's why Tinkerbell is a fairy who can work, he can make things and fix things out of metal.
Is there a particular reason that the fairies didn't like metal?
Yes. It depends on how you look at your origin of fairies. There's several different types of origins of fairies, and no one really knows which one is true. Probably a combination of things like most folklore. In particular, fairies don't like iron. They can deal with most metals. Some fae even like silver, but they hate iron, particularly cold iron. Cold iron is iron that hasn't been heated. You take a lump of iron and you want to make something out of it, like a nail for a door or a horseshoe. You pound it with a hammer. Iron is pretty tough stuff. So to make it more malleable, you put it in a fire till it's red hot, and then you pound it, and once it's hot, then you can reshape it. And then you add carbon to it, and it becomes steel. And steel is very hard and very strong. And it was steel that made possible like nails that held up buildings, and eventually railroad tracks and steam locomotives and so forth. Back in the day, back when the Stone Age was turning into a different age, if you're a tribe who lived in the woods and you had stone points on your arrows, and there was another tribe who knew how to work iron, and they had iron points in their arrows. You know who would win in a fight? Metal was much more powerful than stone or wood or fir, which is what people have been making things out of for thousands of years. And some people say that the fairy lore represents a collision between tribes, some of which knew how to work iron and some of which didn't.
So that accounts for why the fairies don't like metal?
Supposedly. That's one of many theories. The fact is, cold iron will severely injure most fae.
Okay.
The smaller fae, characters the size of Tinkerbell, usually can be killed by it outright. It just weakens other fairies. Metals all had magical properties in those days, and iron could break magic spells.
Okay.
And something made of iron brought you good luck. Are you familiar with the idea of horseshoes bringing luck?
Yeah.
You take a horseshoe and you nail it over a doorway with the curve of it pointing up, and that will keep away evil spirits and mostly keeps away fairies. Because fairies had a nasty tendency to steal human children.
I was just reading about that.
Yep, changeling children.
Oh.
They would take one of their own babies who probably was born deformed,
Yep.
and they would take away the good baby, a human baby, to raise in their land to become a fae, and they would leave their own baby behind.
Huh. And it mentioned to keep something strong.
Well, the fays are a dying race. The fairies have never been strong. One author said they've been a dying race since the day they were invented. So to keep up their strength in their bloodlines, they bring human beings into their fairy world. There are certain things in the human world that they want and need. Sometimes they'll use people to do things for them. Some warriors will fight a battle in the fairyland. The War for the Oaks, with the urban fantasy I mentioned, is based on the idea of a human being pressed into service by fairies to fight their battle for them. So the reality that humans bring, the solidness that they bring, it makes the mercurial world of fairy more real and allows them to accomplish more things. So the world of fairy is very complicated. The first thing you have to know is that there's a lot of different kinds of fairies. They have a million different names. They can spell them several different ways. Since fairies are shapeshifters and tricksters, it's no wonder you can spell it, F-A-I-R-I-E, F-A-R-Y. You can just call them the Fae, F-A-E. The word is French. It's probably related to the same word that we get the word fate from, because fairies are magical and they control human destiny. The lords of fairy, the most powerful ones, were the Tuatha De Danann. They were the children of the goddess Danu. And they clearly represent an elder race that's older than humanity. They ruled the world and were powerful back when human beings were still living in caves and making fire by banging rocks together. And as the human race evolved and changed, they declined in power. Some say they were driven away by Christianity, which is why some fairies don't like church bells. They're also called the She. She is spelled S-I-D-H-E. And boy, did it bother me as a kid trying to pronounce that word. It took me years to figure out it's pronounced she and not city or whatever. Now, you may not have heard the word she before, but you actually already know it. Are you familiar with the banshee?
Okay.
Yep. The last part of that word is she, because it means fairy. A banshee or a banshee is a fairy that's come with a warning of doom or death or destruction or something like that. There were banshees who were attached to powerful families in Ireland for centuries. They weren't evil per se, but their arrival always indicated something bad was about to happen. They're not as bad as the Bane Ni, which is kind of their cousin. The Bane Ni were the old women who were the washers by the river. If you're a warrior going into battle and you saw an old woman washing by banging clothes against a rock along the river, and you happen to notice that she was washing bloodstains out of a tunic that looks exactly like yours, that meant you were about to die. The person whose clothes she were washing was doomed to die. It's a nice portent of death and destruction, using a couple of fairy tales. To enter the world of fairy was sometimes very easy and sometimes very hard. And the Fae did live in their own world. They could enter our world whenever they wanted. They could interact with humans as much as they felt like it, but they had their own universe. It was a parallel universe or a pocket dimension where time flowed differently, space. It wasn't always the same distance from one place to another. It was very fluid. Nothing was solid there. It was a magical world, literally. Sometimes it's easy to enter fairy. You make a wrong turning. You're walking along, you see a path that you never saw before. Like, I never saw that path. You turn down the path and walk a few feet, and then you turn around again, and the path you came on is gone. Because you're not in the real world anymore. You're in the world of fairy. Supposedly it used to be easier in the old days than it is now to enter the world of fairy. There's more like barriers built up around them. But you never know. A lot of urban fantasy stories involving running across the shop you've never seen before in a city. And you go in, they sell you something magical or something becomes important later in the book. And if you see fairies trooping, fairies will sometimes go out and they will ride their fairy horses and they will go hunting sometimes. If you see a troop of fairies wandering along and you follow them, you'll wind up in their world, which is often disastrous.
Okay, so you mentioned the names being difficult to pronounce. So I can't make this out, but apparently one of the male fairies was a womanizer. So do they procreate the same way?
Yes. They have fairy lovers who will seduce you and like gradually drain away your life. It's usually bad to be involved with a fairy, although not always. Later on we'll get to some examples where it's turned out more or less okay. They do want to have interactions with humans like that. The fae are all incredibly beautiful, but they can also cast a charm on you called glamour that makes them appear beautiful whether they are or not.
Okay.
Yes, the beautiful woman or the handsome guy we into could actually be a hideous, ugly hag. You never know. There's a way of seeing through fairy glamour. You can find a stone that has a hole in it that's been formed naturally. Like if dripping water has gouged out a hole in a stone, you can peer through that hole and see right through fairy glamour.
It's incredibly detailed to be imagined.
It is a rich and complex culture they've invented. Fairy stories have been going around for thousands of years. Now, one way to get to fairy is crossroads. Where two roads meet is very powerful and very dangerous. And Lord help you if you're at a place where three roads meet, that's even worse. A crossroad was magical because a crossroad, if you're at a crossroads, are you on this road? Are you on that road? Are you here or are you there?
Okay.
If you're at a crossroads, you're not anywhere. A crossroads is a liminal place, as they call it today, a place where two worlds collide.
Okay.
And the more roads there are that come together, the more powerful a place that it is. In witchcraft, Hecate was the goddess of crossroads.
So would that spot function like a portal?
It could be. You can run into a fairy at the crossroads quite easily.
Okay.
It's also a place you go to make a deal with the devil if you want to become a great blues guitar player, but that's another story. So crossroads are powerful. The best way of all to get to fairy is to enter a ring of mushrooms. Have you ever walked in the woods and seen an almost perfect circle of mushrooms growing there?
I can't say that I have.
It happens. It happens a lot.
All right.
Now, in the old days, mushrooms were considered to be magical for a couple of reasons. First of all, unlike every other kind of plant, mushrooms don't have seeds. Now, we know today in our scientific world, mushrooms aren't plants, they're fungus. And they don't have seeds, they have spores. But the spore of a mushroom is so tiny, you almost can't see it.
Right.
That's like that brown dust that crumbles off of the underneath of a mushroom sometimes. And that's their spores, that's how they reproduce. So one mushroom will be there, it gets to a certain size, and the wind will carry away spores, and often carry it in a circle around it. And the original one gets stepped on or dies, and it leaves behind a perfect circle of mushrooms right in the middle of the woods. Since circles don't occur that often in nature, it's got to be magical. You could step into a fairy ring or a ring of mushrooms and get taken to the fairy realm. But once you get there, though, you have a lot of rules to follow, and you have to follow them. The first one is don't carry any iron with you. Don't carry a pocket knife, nothing made of iron. Steel, some fairies can deal with steel, but for the most part, you don't want any metal on you at all, just to be on the safe side.
Okay.
While you're in the realm of fairy, do not eat anything. One of the most firm rules is, if you partake of the food of fairy, it will enter you. You'll become part fae yourself, and you'll lose the power to go back to the real world. It could be trapped there forever, or sometimes just 100 years or so.
So in doing so, does that mean that you take on their qualities and powers?
Not necessarily, it just means you're trapped there.
Oh.
That's a folklore bit that goes back a long, long way, because it's the same story you find in the Greek myth of Persephone, who was trapped at least part of the year in Hades by eating pomegranates, or part of a pomegranate.
Okay.
When you're there, be polite, be respectful, be humble. The fairies expect that, and they kind of demand it. Never boast or brag. Never say you're the best at something, or no one can beat me at such and such, because you'll be called on that, and you will lose every time. Fairies in old stories love to wander around and hear somebody bragging about being able to do something, and they use their magic to make sure it screws up every time he tries it from then on for the rest of his life. That happens a lot. Every word you say is important, so watch what you say. If you make a promise in the land of fairy, that is an oath that you must keep on pain of death. If you say something that you don't really mean, like you do all the time, like if you say to a fairy and you're in the fairy realm, I'd give my right arm for a chest of gold, he will immediately rip off your right arm and hand you a big chest overflowing with gold. And as you're bleeding to death, he'll say, well, I gave you what you wanted.
Okay.
Yeah, the fairy concept of right and wrong and good and evil isn't a human one. From the fairy's point of view, he did exactly what you asked for. Fairies don't look at life and death the same way that we do. Remember, in Peter Pan, Tinkerbell was the most innocent and innocuous of all fairies. She still tried to murder Wendy twice. That didn't make it into the Disney cartoon. But yeah, in Jay and Barry's original, Tinkerbell totally tries to murder Wendy because she's jealous of her. Yeah, so those are fairies for you. Fairies operate on bargains and deals.
Okay.
You get things from them by making a deal with them, and you always have to keep it. They have ways of ensuring that. And they're bound by the deal the same way that you are. For instance, you can't accept a gift from a fairy unless you have something of equal value to return. So if a fairy offers to give you a pouch that will never run out of gold, you should either refuse it politely or say, but I have nothing to give you in return, because you don't. He's given you a pouch that will make you rich for the rest of your life. The fairy will have to say, I give this to you freely with no obligation, and then you may take it.
Oh.
Because fairies also can't actually lie.
Okay.
They can imply things, they can say misleading things, but they can't actually physically lie to you. If a fae says you are free to go, you can walk out the door and he won't stab you in the back or try to stop you in any way. But if he says you may go when the clock strikes 12, he'll then immediately cast a spell to freeze all the clocks in his land, so it'll never strike 12. And then you're stuck unless you can make a better bargain. Like, but I shall leave when the sun strikes my father's house at sunrise. And he's not nearly powerful enough to stop the sun from rising, so you've proudly beaten him and can go when it's dawn back in the mortal world. But time in fairy is very difficult to judge. Have you been there for a few hours? Have you been there for a week or a year? You never really know. Rip Van Winkle found that out the hard way. And that's an American story that still echoes with all this fairy lore that got carried over, because America was settled by English people and Irish people and Scottish people who all brought these stories with them.
Right.
The old stories that immigrants brought to America is one of the themes of Neil Gaiman's American Gods. All right, so also, never give them your name. A name has power. If they know your real name, they'll be able to cast a spell over you that you have no defense against. And also, always accept whatever name a fairy gives you. If a fairy says, my name is Tom TikTok, then it's Tom TikTok, and don't argue with him, you know?
Because they can't lie, right?
Yeah. On the other hand, he's also not giving you his real name. He's giving you a name he will answer to, but it's not his true name.
So you would specifically
Yeah.
have to say, what is your true name?
Yeah, but he won't answer that. He doesn't have to answer that.
Oh.
He's under no obligation to answer your questions. If he does answer, he must answer truthfully. He'll simply deflect the question.
Okay.
So if you were to go to the realm of fairy and someone were to ask you your name, what kind of thing would you think he would say?
If someone were to
Asking
ask
you in the
my
realm of
name,
fairy, yes.
So I'd have to make something up.
Yes.
Okay.
You can say anything. You can say, I'm the maid from Woonsocket. and you will be Fair Maid, or you will be known as Woonsocket from then on in the realm of the Fae. That will be your name and your title.
Okay.
Always have a spare name handy, just in case.
I actually do in real life, and it's,
Okay.
It's Erica.
You didn't have to tell me, but yeah. No, having a name you can use when you're dealing with this sort of thing is always very, very helpful.
Okay.
Don't say thank you. If they give you something or do something for you, do not thank them. Because if you say thank you, that means you're obligated to them. You're thanking them, which means you owe them. Then he'll usually ask for something in return. Instead, just say things like, you are most kind, or I appreciate your kindness. You always recognize that they've done you a good turn, but don't say thank you. That will trap you. Like I said, everything is a bargain or a deal with them. Every transaction is a bargain that's guarded by their powerful magic. And a wise person can use that to their advantage. Now, there was a story about a man whose wife was enchanted by a fairy lord. And he put a glamour on the man's wife and was taking her away to fairyland. And the husband, of course, was trying to stop this. And so he says, very well, what's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. And he took off his hat and he threw it to the fairy, who instinctively grabbed it. And the second he touched the hat, the man grabbed his wife's arm and led her back again, and the spell was broken. Because he had struck a deal with the fairy, a hat for his wife. Not fair deal, but in grabbing the hat out of the air, the fairy accepted it.
Yep.
And he couldn't go back on it now. The woman was free. Yeah, so you can trick a fairy, and in general, fairies don't mind being tricked. If you pull one over on them, except for a few really nasty fairies, for the most part, they don't mind being fooled. They respect that.
They appreciate your
Yes,
cleverness.
yes. There's a very great movie that Walt Disney Company did called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. It's from 1959. It stars a ridiculously young Sean Connery. It's about a Irish guy who manages to capture the king of the leprechauns, who's forced to grant him 3 wishes. And the king of the leprechauns really resents Darby O'Gill's control over him. But on the other hand, by the time all the wishes are spent, he's come to respect Darby, and they actually become allies toward the end. So they will respect someone who's shown their intelligence to them. People who use force, people who try to get things out of them people who lie to them or try to trick them, that they will not tolerate. They will see through that every time. I mentioned the changeling children. There's also a concept of fairy wives. Marrying a woman from fairy are all very beautiful, and many of them have magic powers. And there's many different ways that you can win a fairy, sometimes sneakily and sometimes not. Some of the fey creatures are beautiful swan maidens. They're swans part of the time and human part of the time. And when they climb out of the water, they take off their feather cloak and lay it on the ground, and they cavort and land as humans for a while. And if a man can find that feather cloak and keep it, then she'll have to marry him.
Oh.
Now that's kind of sort of a little bit like rape.
Yeah.
She has no choice but to marry you. Most of the stories downplay that and show the guy being very good to his fairy bride. But inevitably, the cloak is magic and can't be destroyed. And when she finds it again, it's all over. If you treat her badly, it'll really be all over for you. There's no question she will have magic friends on the other side.
I'm noticing water fairies.
Yes, there's a whole class of water fairies. You have the classic mermaids that are known all over the world. You have undines.
Wait, a mermaid is a fairy?
They're a type of fairy. Most people consider them a type of fairy.
Also,
But you have mermaids from almost every culture on the earth. Has some kind of creature living in the water, often female, because the sea was considered very changeable and moody, like a woman, to a sailor, you know. Yeah. There's fairy, the classic European fairy, where she's half human and half fish. You have Mama Wate from Africa, who also made the transition into Voodoo mythology when the slaves were brought over from there. They're all different versions of mermaids. You had undines, the classic water spirits from Greek mythology. There was the Puka, which is a shape-shifting fairy from Scotland. Changed in almost any shape, but they preferred to become a horse, and they'd run into the water where they could breathe, but you couldn't, and you would drown. it was always good to know the true name of an animal. Even knowing its species, if you saw a magical animal identifying it, would take away some of its power over you. Before we go, I know a story about a guy who had a fairy wife.
Okay.
Right. As I said, there are many ways of winning a fairy wife, and you can just woo them, and they will marry you if you're a good man and so forth. This is a story that's set in Ulster, long, long time ago.
Wait, where's Ulster?
It's in Ireland.
Okay.
Yes. This is one of the stories of the Red Branch Heroes of Ireland. Now, there was a man who was very lucky, but he was also very foolish. He was lucky because he had a fairy bride. She was very beautiful and very powerful. And they were very happy together. She had many magic abilities, and he had even gotten her with child. So that was very fortunate. However, he was also very foolish. One day, when he was in a pub, he was drinking and had a little too much to drink. And he boasted that his wife could run so fast, she could outrun the fastest horse in the land. And who should be in the pub at the time but the king? And the king says, well, I have the fastest horse in the land, so I will challenge your wife to a race with my horse, and we'll see who wins. And if you lose, you will lose your head. So yes, so he goes home and he immediately says to his wife, honey, I'm really sorry, but you have to race the king's fastest horse. And she's like, but husband, I am with child. And he's like, you don't have any choice. You have to do this or I will die. And so she says, because you are my husband, I will obey you. But I warn you, if you ask me to do this, it will not end well. And so, sure enough, the day came when his very pregnant wife would race the fastest horse in the land. And they chose the race from the bottom of a tall hill up to the top of the hill. And so the wife set off and the horse set off and they're galloping up the hill going higher and higher, and the wife pulls ahead and beats the horse to the top of the hill. But then she cries out in horrible agony, because brace yourself. She cries out in horrible agony because the strain of what she's done is induced labor.
Right. And
she's had her child. And she gets very angry and she looks down at all the people of Ulster, the men of Ulster assembled below her. And she says, because you have forced me to undergo all this agony just to amuse yourselves, I will curse you with the pains of childbirth every year at this time. So all the men of Ulster were cursed by her. And then she holds up the newborn boy and says, and look upon your son, my husband, because you shall ne'er see him again. And she stamped her foot and the mountain opened up and she and her baby sank into the earth. It was never again seen by mortal men.
I like her.
Yep. Now the fact she cursed the men of Ulster becomes very important in another story. That's a story of Cuchulainn, but that's a story for another time. I think we've done everything we can cover in our very short, brief introduction. We have much more to talk about next time. So until then, be careful, take care of yourself. I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.